The Oxford Mobility Study. John Goldthorpe. One of the most important studies in British sociology of education and social stratification is the Oxford Mobility Study, led by the sociologist John H. Goldthorpe, conducted in the 1970s at the University of Oxford. This research fundamentally shaped our understanding of social mobility in Britain. The study set out to answer a key sociological question: how open is British society? In other words, do people have genuine equality of opportunity to move between social classes, or does class background continue to shape life chances? Aims of the study. Goldthorpe's main aim was to measure patterns of intergenerational social mobility, that is, whether individuals ended up in a different social class from their fathers. He wanted to move beyond assumptions and provide robust statistical evidence about mobility in Britain. A crucial part of the study was distinguishing between two different types of mobility: absolute mobility, the total amount of movement between classes; relative mobility, the chances of people from different class backgrounds reaching particular class positions. This distinction was important because a society might appear mobile overall, yet still maintain strong inequalities in opportunity. Methods. The Oxford Mobility Study used a large-scale quantitative approach. Goldthorpe analyzed data from around 10,000 men in Britain, comparing their occupations with those of their fathers. Occupation was used as the main indicator of social class. He developed a class schema that grouped occupations into categories such as the service class, professionals and managers, the intermediate class, and the working class. By comparing fathers and sons' class positions, Goldthorpe was able to measure both upward and downward mobility and assess patterns across British society. The study relied on statistical analysis rather than interviews or case studies. This gave it strong reliability and allowed broad generalizations about mobility trends. Key findings. The findings were both optimistic and critical. First, Goldthorpe found that absolute mobility had increased in post-war Britain. Around half of men were in a different class position from their fathers. At first glance, this suggests Britain had become more open. However, when Goldthorpe examined relative mobility, a different picture emerged. Although more people were moving between classes, the chances of moving up were still heavily influenced by class background. Children from service class families were far more likely to remain in or move into top positions than children from working class backgrounds. In other words, inequality of opportunity persisted. Goldthorpe argued that much of the increase in mobility was due to structural changes in the economy, such as the expansion of professional and managerial jobs. There were simply more middle-class jobs available. This created room for upward movement, but it did not mean that the playing field had become equal. The study also suggested that although educational participation expanded, education alone did not eliminate class inequalities. Middle-class families were better able to use their economic, social, and cultural resources to maintain advantage. Strengths of the study. Oxford Mobility Study has several major strengths. It used a large, representative dataset, increasing reliability. It introduced the vital distinction between absolute and relative mobility, which remains central to sociological analysis today. It developed a clear and systematic class schema, which later influenced official classifications such as the NS-Sec. It was replicated and extended in later research, strengthening its credibility. Because of this, Goldthorpe's work remains foundational in the study of social stratification, weaknesses, and criticism. However, the study is not without criticism. First, the original research focused primarily on men. Women's class positions were often recorded in relation to their husbands, meaning female mobility patterns were underanalyzed. Second, some critics argued that the occupational class categories were too broad and may not fully reflect the complexity of modern labor markets. Third, while the study mapped mobility patterns very effectively, it did less to explain why inequalities persist. Later sociologists have focused more on cultural capital. social networks and institutional barriers to explain these patterns. Overall conclusion and conclusion. The Oxford Mobility Study demonstrated that Britain became more mobile in terms of overall movement between classes, but it did not become fully meritocratic. Inequalities in opportunity remain deeply embedded. Goldthorpe's key message was that we must look beyond simple upward movement and ask whether everyone has the same chance to succeed. His distinction between absolute and relative mobility continues to shape debates about class, education, and social policy today. For higher sociology, this study is essential for understanding how sociologists measure social mobility and why claims about equal opportunity must always be examined critically.